All right, so I don't really talk about current events, but I do think this one's actually very important if you're a software engineer and you're trying to deploy your applications in a resilient, reliable way. So this one is basically there's been some data centers in the UAE, Middle East regions that have been damaged. And this has actually caused probably a lot of issues with a bunch of applications running in those areas. And I think current events like this, although they're very rare, like obviously data centers, often you just host your application there and it just works. You don't have to think about it. It always just works. But I think a current event like this really puts in perspective that if there is a type of, conflict or a war, your data, is it potentially safe where you're hosting it? Do you have your stuff hosted in multiple regions? Do you have it hosted in multiple availability zones in those regions? Because if you don't, all it takes is a couple of drone strikes and now all your data in your entire application is basically offline or gone. And do you have a way to basically spin that all back up extremely fast with the touch of a button using infrastructure as code? Or are you going to be offline for, who knows how long before you can go and host it somewhere else? And if you go to another, it looks like 2 of the UAE data centers were hit by drone strikes, and there's been a third one that's damaged. And so the way these regions kind of work in AWS is you have a huge list of regions that you can actually host your infrastructure in. So often we use like East 1 and East 2 or West 1 and West 2 in the United States. But in other countries, you have stuff in Asia, you have stuff in India, you have stuff in Europe, you have stuff in the Middle East. And these are where you can actually have your physical things running. But another thing that maybe you might not know about is inside these regions, for example, if we go to the Middle East, there's ME Central 1 and there's also ME South 1. These are the 2 regions that are available in the Middle East. And if you look at these regions, they have different availability zones. So if you look at this, typically there's 3 physical locations. If you were to look at a map, the UAE, there should be 3 physical locations that this data kind of lives. So hopefully, if AWS isn't lying to us, there probably should be a data center in maybe, this city over here. There should probably be one over here. And then hopefully there should be one, somewhere else in case there was a, dramatic flood that flooded both of these cities, or there's like a war like we're kind of talking about where these things are getting drone striked. If, these 2 data centers were to go offline, at least this one could potentially still stay running. And I think when you're hosting your applications, it's good to keep this in mind because putting all your eggs in one basket is kind of concerning if you want to have a system that is reliable. Now, luckily, in terms of AWS, if you're using something like RDS, often you can have RDS automatically spin up and you can provide which availability zones that you want RDS to run in. And you can also have it set up with multi-region support. Often there's like a primary write node, and then you have a fallback read replica so that if something were to go wrong in your primary, everything would fall back to your read replica, and that would be kind of promoted your write node, and your stuff would basically still just work, right? There might be some downtime as it's trying to transition over. You might have some users have some interrupted traffic, but overall your data is still there. It's been backed up consistently to a replica. In the case that something were to go wrong and your stuff gets, the data center gets messed up, your stuff is still available. Okay, so when you're building an application, obviously you should probably have one, RDS instance inside one region, so like US East 1. And then inside of that, you should have like 2 to 3 availability zones for your data to live in case something were to go wrong. And these are actually different physical locations so that a catastrophic event like a hurricane, tornado, a flood, a fire doesn't mess up your data. And then on top of that, typically you want to have a different region. So in the US, we have like East 1 and West 1, where you'd have, like I mentioned, you have a primary write node with RDS. And then over here, you have a read replica, which all the data is basically just, written to the read replica with some pretty good latency so that if something were to go wrong with RDS on East 1, all your users or all your APIs would then fail over to then use something like, this read replica instead. But something that you should also point out is outside of the database, you should probably also be concerned about your actual web application. So if you have a web application running somewhere, again, these should be hosted in different regions as well, so that not only do your users in certain regions get faster latency, they can also point to different databases if something were to go down. So typically you'd have like a server with East 1, you have a server with West 1, but again, you might have the database working just fine, but if this thing was pointed to use this, and all your users are connected to East 1, and then something goes wrong with this database, you should have a way to automatically have it point to your running replica. So at least your users can like read the data. And then often AWS has stuff in place where this stuff will automatically like switch over. You know, you can do load balancers and stuff like that. I did want to keep this video short and sweet. Like I didn't want to dive into like how to set this stuff all up, but I do want to point out that like if you're hosting a database or web application, these are things you should hopefully keep in mind. At least have your data like hosted in different regions. Your web application and your database should be hosted in different regions. And at the very least, you should definitely have some type of backups going on. So even if you don't have multi-region setup or availability zones set up, you should have some type of backups that are running every night so that if your database gets deleted, you can at least try to restore to a certain point inside some other region and then point your application web servers to that new region, okay? Now, a lot of the times you can have this all set up with infrastructure as code with like a click of a button, but I would probably reevaluate what you're doing in your project and do some like run through some scenarios. If something were to go wrong with our data center, how much effort would it take? How much work would it take? Who would you have to talk to get everything respun up in a different location so that your users actually are able to use your application? Okay, so I think it's good to at least look into availability zones, regions. If you're working on a small side project, it's probably not as important. But these are things that you do want to keep in mind. And there's an actual whole profession called site reliability engineers who need to really understand how this stuff all kind of works. So if that's something you're interested in, go read up more about site reliable engineers and what they do, because I do think this is something that is kind of important to know about. And having all your data gone because of a drone strike is something you should probably keep in mind. All right, I don't want to dive into too much detail on this. I think it's just something to point out that was interesting to me. All right, have a good day. Happy coding.